Today, in our conversation, we're going to focus on the second identity that President Nelson identified to guide our life, which is a child of the covenant. So, what is the child of the covenant identity? Simply put, the child of God identity is the right to the promises attached to the new and everlasting covenant. The same covenant that our Heavenly Father offered to all of us in our earliest stages of existence. President Nelson said, the right to live where and how God lives, and ultimately to become more and more like Him. His plan literally makes the richest blessings of all eternity available to you, including the potential for you to become joint heirs with Jesus Christ. Now, the new and everlasting covenant addresses some of the oldest and most foundational questions of our life on earth. It answers, for example, the question of moral agency. It addresses the nature of God, and it gives us perspective on the origin of evil. The new and everlasting covenant, as we'll talk about today, is much, much older than that and comprehends all of the promises, all of the Father's plan of salvation to each of His Spirit children. But in order to understand the new and everlasting covenant, we need to go back to our starting place. And the best source that we have for understanding our life at our starting place is through the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. When you go into section 93 of the Doctrine and Covenants, for example, certain truths emerge there that give us some perspective that is very helpful in understanding the new and everlasting covenant. For example, we learn in section 93 that intelligence, or the mind of man, the part of us that makes us who we really are, has been around for a long, long time. In fact, it is co-eternal with God and was not created, neither can it be created. That's helpful. That helps us understand that our agency is not something that God put into us. Instead, it helps us understand that our moral agency is an eternal endowment that has always existed and makes us who we are, and that our first covenant offering from our Heavenly Father was to protect and ensure that that agency would not be compromised. Joseph Smith, in the King Follett Discourse, gives us perspective on our condition in our first state. He says, speaking of our Heavenly Father, the Most High God, finding Himself in the midst of spirits and glory, because He was more intelligent, saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest could have a privilege to advance like Himself. So in that teaching alone, we start to see and learn something about the motivations and character of our Heavenly Father. We learn, for instance, He is a being that is deeply concerned and has been at work for a long time in helping spirits or intelligences advance like unto Himself. And second, it's at the foundation of who He is to lift and help exalt the spirits around Him. Now, in our first instance, as a spirit or as an intelligence, though we had our agency, we were not in any type of covenantal relationship with the Most High God. It was because of this that our Father offered us an opportunity to enter into a covenantal relationship with Him. So in that very first instance, we had our Heavenly Father made certain promises to all of us. First, that He would, if we would choose to enter into a relationship with Him, He would safeguard our moral agency. He would ensure at all costs that that would not be violated or compromised. Second, He offered unto us the opportunity to enter into a parent-child relationship with Him, something that we were not then yet in. Our first state, it appears we were not even yet spirit children of our heavenly parents. That was something that came as an initial offering of us exercising our agency in this new and everlasting covenant. And that led to our Heavenly Father's last promise, which was to provide us with a spiritual body as a first step towards receiving a glorified physical and spiritual body like unto his own. Now, our promises to him in our first state was that we would obey his commandments. We would honor our parent-child relationship that he offered unto us, and we would obtain eventually, or have the opportunity to obtain, a glorified body of flesh and bone like his own. That was the condition in our very first instance with the Most High God. And because we were obedient unto it, we entered into a parent-child relationship with him, and it put us on a path to becoming like him. Now just think for a minute how persuasive it must have been to all of us in that first instinct, how just powerful and compelling the glorified body of our heavenly parents must have looked to each of us. We don't have a lot of instances in the scriptures that detail what a glorified body of flesh and bone looks like, but we do have a few. If you remember in Joseph Smith history, Joseph recounts what it was like to see the Father and the Son in his experience in the grove near his home. And he described their bodies as personages of brightness and glory that defy description. And then you remember later on the visitation of Moroni into his bedroom, he described a body that had a countenance like lightning. So the inability to adequately describe such a glorified body is evidence what it must have felt like for us in our first instincts, how compelling it was to want something similar. And because of that desire, we assume, and because of our Father's extension of the new and everlasting covenant to us, we could then take those initial steps to receive a spiritual body in the likeness and form of not only the Most High God's, but also of our future physical bodies. Later on in the King Follett Discourse, Joseph describes the next offering of our Heavenly Father to each of us in the new and everlasting covenant, and he likened it unto a ladder. He said, when you climb a ladder, you must begin at the bottom and go on until you learn the last principle. It will be a great while before you have learned the last. It's not all to be comprehended in this world, and it's a great thing to learn salvation beyond the grave. From this, we imply that salvation and the pursuit of exaltation is a multi-step process that begins early on at our starting place and continues long after our death and resurrection. We learn that there's more to do to receive a glorified physical body, and in order to inherit a condition like unto our heavenly parents, there were going to be certain requirements, obligations to assume for ourselves, certain responsibilities to fulfill in order to realize the fullness of promises that are attached to the new and everlasting covenant. If you think about our initial state and what the new and everlasting covenant ladder afforded each of us, you can think of it across three different dimensions. One is the ladder of the new and everlasting covenant takes us from our initial state, our starting point, and helps us advance through various estates that are progressive in nature and convey different experiences and associated promises. Second, the new and everlasting covenant afforded us a continuum of a relationship where we could move from not being within a relationship at all with heavenly beings, moving into a father-child relationship at our first estate, then into a servant-child-friend relationship in our second estate, and finally culminating in a joint heir relationship with Jesus Christ and our heavenly parents. The final offering that the new and everlasting covenant ladder gives to all of us is to move from our initial condition as intelligences, receive a spiritual body in our first estate, our premortal estate, then in a second estate receive a physical body in the same likeness and image as our spirit, and then finally in the third estate after the resurrection to receive a glorified body of flesh and bone that's forever united. So to facilitate our ascent, our Heavenly Father gave us a plan of salvation to help us move through or move up the ladder of the new and everlasting covenant. And the plan provided four fundamentals to help our ascent within the covenant. First, it provided a physical earth, a place where we could gain experiences to become like our heavenly parents. Second, it provided a forum of opposition to apply our agency more fully. Our Heavenly Father could not simply give us the promises without our use of our moral agency in an environment where that could be adequately tested to reveal what we really want for an eternal inheritance. Nor could he just blanket give us or transfer to us his character, his nature. And as we'll talk in a minute, instead he uses vehicles called covenants that enable the transfer of godly character or godly attributes to us within the broader new and everlasting covenant. The third thing that our Heavenly Father offered us through his plan of salvation that, again, helps us move up the ladder of the new and everlasting covenant is the opportunity to be tested, to learn for ourselves who we are and what we really want. And finally, the fourth is a judgment, a final assessment of what we've become, and with the assurance that it would be done completely just and in an equitable fashion based on our use of the light within us to reveal what we've become. So the plan of salvation, again, was designed to help us ascend this ladder and to draw nearer to our heavenly parents and provide the opportunity to equitably transfer not only the fullness of his promises, we're talking about kingdoms and thrones, but also the transfer of his righteous character to all of us. Now, we talked about the role of covenants within the new and everlasting covenant to help our acquisition of divine attributes and character. Within the new and everlasting covenant, our Heavenly Father offers to us two different types. One is called a unilateral covenant, and the second is a bilateral covenant. In a unilateral covenant, there's only one person involved in establishing the terms and conditions and extending the offering. There's the promises attached, again, are determined by the promisor. And in our case, that is always done by our Heavenly Father, as well as the conditions are set by the promisor. And if you compare that to a bilateral covenant, it's different. Here, even though one person sets the terms and conditions and the promises of the covenant, more than one party's involved in bringing the covenant to pass and to realize the terms and conditions. Both parties make promises to each other within a bilateral covenant, and both parties must agree on the conditions in order for them to be justly complied with. Now, what do we mean by unilateral covenants? An example of a unilateral covenant, again, you see these around you all the time. Imagine you're pulling up to a stop sign and you look over on the pole and you see a flyer and it says, it's a picture of a dog and it says missing, reward $500 if found, call this number. That's an example of a unilateral covenant. One party has set the terms and the promised reward, and it offers it freely without conditions to anyone who chooses to act upon the terms. Now, you may choose to fulfill those terms and receive your reward, but you're under no obligation to. You can simply just look straight ahead, light goes green, drive away, and you're no worse for the wear. But anyone who chose to pursue the fulfillment of those conditions and actually found the dog and returned it to the owner would be entitled to the reward. That's an example of a unilateral covenant. Now, in the gospel framework, we have several examples of this. One is the law of tithing. Our Heavenly Father has said that to anyone who pays their 1/10 of their increase annually will receive windows of heaven, will be opened up. All of the blessings that come with fulfilling that term. Now, anyone can choose to walk away from those terms and not be any worse off, but for those who comply, the blessings stand as an opportunity to receive the promised blessings. Another example is the word of wisdom. The word of wisdom is anyone who chooses to obey the terms set forth in the word of wisdom and to eat and live their life by adhering to those conditions can receive the promise of health in their navel and strength in their bones and run and not be weary, etc., etc., to rise up with wings as eagles. Another example is the Sabbath day. Anyone who wants to keep the Sabbath, to make it a delight, to do the things indicated in the 9th section of the Doctrine and Covenants would receive the blessings of the Sabbath. The Lord uses unilateral covenants within his restored gospel to prepare us to receive and enter into bilateral covenants, obligations where there are reciprocal agreements to the conditions set forth, where both parties make promises to each other to act, and both parties receive blessings as a result of their actions. Initially, unilateral covenants, early in our history, they were not obligatory. But as more of the restoration is unfolded, we've seen that they've become preparatory. You must, for example, commit to keep and fulfill and live your life by unilateral covenants before you can be baptized. And you must continue to keep those unilateral covenants before you can enter the temple, for example, receive a temple recommend. So they are mutually reinforcing to the obligations we assume within a bilateral covenant framework. Elder Renlund spoke about the synergistic relationship between our bilateral covenants on the covenant path. He said multiple covenants, speaking specifically about bilateral covenants, are not only sequential, they are additive and synergistic in our relationship with God. Here, you see laid out how the covenant we make at baptism is aligned and reinforcing to additional bilateral covenants that we make within the temple endowment and finally within our temple sealing. You might ask the question, well, why are unilateral covenants insufficient for exaltation? I want to explain this point, an experience I had with a leader of another church. We were speaking at work, and he was talking about the challenge that his leadership team at his local church was having in how to spend the money that they had to meet all the needs for their congregation. He asked me, do you have the same challenges in your church? And I said, well, we don't, because we live the law of tithing. He said, well, we don't live the law of tithing, so the burden of paying for many of our expenses falls upon a few members of our congregation. And I asked him, well, does your congregation believe in baptism? And he said, we do. And I said, well, what do they understand about their responsibilities that they assume when they're baptized? And he said, well, that's the problem right there. We believe that baptism is a sign to God of our willingness to follow Jesus Christ and be his disciple, but it doesn't obligate us to do so. So another way of saying it, this congregation and their members viewed baptism as a unilateral covenant, something that they could look at and acknowledge, but they were free to walk away from without any obligation to meet the conditions required by their baptism. And that's comes to the heart of the issue about why bilateral covenants are needed in order to ascend up the ladder of the new and everlasting covenant and fully assume the promises that our Heavenly Father's offered to all of us. Because unlike a unilateral covenant, a bilateral covenant conveys real obligations to the receivers. In unilateral covenants, people can come and go as they please without any obligations. But in a bilateral covenant, individuals assume real obligations to act. And the promises are only conveyed upon the fulfillment of those obligations. As we make a succession of bilateral covenants, a number of things happen. One, our risk of wandering from the covenant path is reduced because of the additive binding effect of the covenants upon our minds and hearts. As we acknowledge and fully assume our obligations, something happens to our minds and hearts that tethers us more tightly to our Heavenly Father's words, and our desires to become like Him are enhanced. Second, our love of God as we fulfill our covenant obligations, and His love for us deepens as our minds and hearts are aligned. Third, we receive increased safety and assurance because within the terms of the covenant, God will protect us, lift us, and exhaust every effort in providing for us. That's what He covenants to do as part of these bilateral obligations. So we find ourselves feeling more assured of the promises that He has made to us because we are striving and doing our best to fulfill the obligations we've made with Him. And fourth, our discipleship of Jesus Christ is increased because step by step, line upon line, precept upon precept, as we fulfill our covenant obligations, we obtain His mind and follow His example in all things. Part of the obligations that we assume within the temple is to obey His commandments, to sacrifice our heart, and to submit our will to His. We willingly choose to consecrate ourselves and give anything beyond what we need back to God and act as stewards over those things that we receive from Him, to use them wisely and in the best possible way towards our neighbor, for our families, and for the people around us. And so fulfilling those covenantal obligations transforms us to agree to the point where He can then convey part of the nature and character of godly beings to our minds and hearts. And by the way, those things can only be transferred in the way that the Lord has outlined through a succession of bilateral covenant offerings. So we see that the child of the covenant, that identity, is tightly coupled with the child of God identity. In order to become the sons and daughters of God and to receive the power to be transformed, we find that we must live and accept and assume and fulfill covenantal obligations within the broader new and everlasting covenant framework to ascend the ladder of opportunity that our Father makes available to all of His Spirit sons and daughters. If you enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Follow us on the Power of Godliness on Facebook and Instagram. And let us know what you think about the conversation in the comments below.